Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our fourth and final episode of The Progress Profile Alzheimer's Research in Focus, a podcast series dedicated to advancing understanding of Alzheimer's research, diagnosis, and treatment. My name is Lindsay Simmis. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and director of business development for Pearson Clinical Assessment's Pharmaceutical Division. Over the course of this series, we've heard from some of the world's foremost Alzheimer's experts. In episode 1, Dr. Jeffrey Cummings discussed current research shaping our understanding of potential causes and treatments. In episode 2, Dr. Philip Sheltons explained the amyloid hypothesis and its central role in Alzheimer's research. In episode 3, Dr. Mia Kivipelto discussed whether Alzheimer's risk is rooted in genetics or shaped by environment and lifestyle. Today, we close the series by focusing on early diagnosis, and particularly the vital role that biomarkers can play. Leading today's conversation is our fantastic moderator, Dr. John Harrison. Dr. Harrison is joined by the esteemed Dr. Rhoda Au, professor of anatomy and neurobiology, neurology, medicine, and epidemiology at the Boston University Chobanian and Avedisian School of Medicine and School of Public Health. Her research includes technologies to promote equal opportunity in science and to develop and validate multi-sensor digital biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Harrison to begin today's discussion.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Lindsay. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Rhoda Au. Rhoda, let's begin by talking about some of the more exciting cutting-edge technologies that are currently being developed for Alzheimer's, and in particular, how tools, even like digital gameplay, are being harnessed to monitor changes in cognition, please.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and I really look forward to our discussion today. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is this shift that we're doing that's getting away from measuring cognition using sort of our traditional standardized neuropsychological tests that we tend to administer sporadically and are very static instruments. As we know, cognition is something actually that's highly variable. It's actually variable for us moment to moment across the day. And what's really great is now we have all these digital devices. There's an estimated about 41 billion Internet of Things connected devices, which all contain all these different sensors, which I really think of as uh, data collection tools, right? And so they're able to actually collect our natural behavior as we move through our environment on a day to day basis. So I really think it's this possibility of harnessing the power of all these digital sensors and really thinking about how do we take this bring your own device concept and really use that to help us start to think about how do we measure cognition and how can we do it then far more accurately and again continuously and also much more accurately than we have been doing.
A great place to start, Rhoda, and I completely agree. One of the things that we always want to measure as psychologists, isn't it, is the competence of our study participants, and we end up measuring their performance. And sometimes there's an awful lot that gets in between those things. Time of day, did you sleep well last night, anxiety, agitation, all those things. And most of the conversations I've been party to recently seem to work on the premise that there's one way to screen people in. And I feel very strongly that actually, I think it's at this point by any means necessary. And to take up your point about naturalistic data collection, I get to hang out with the Games for Health people. How they let me in, I don't know. I'm really not cool enough to hang out with those kind of guys. But one of the great revelations for me was being introduced to things like online multiple role-playing games. And something like World of Warcraft. When I was watching people playing World of Warcraft, I suddenly realized that what they were actually doing is highly motivated cognitive testing. These guys were fishing, and it was a simple reaction time paradigm, and it looked really obvious to me that that was it. But unlike, sometimes in the lab for people like you and I, we're having to, coach people and cajole them into doing their best. These guys' success in the game depended on being really quick. So you imagine the variability in their performance is probably quite small. So any deviation from that, one assumes, would be good evidence that they were slightly off color, or maybe even the earliest signs of some progressive decline. So I think for me, it is by any means necessary. I guess the issue around collecting data from smartphones, from online game playing, is always going to be the issue of privacy, which oftentimes gets in the way, and I perfectly appreciate for very good reasons. But maybe we could get people to opt in. What would be your take, Rhoda?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting that when we come to research, we talk a lot about privacy, and I'm not saying that that's not really important. But as we actually engage naturally in our real environments, I always wonder about how much, with my use of digital devices, do the various companies that provide them are tracking me. And I suspect that many of them know more about me than probably my husband does. And so I think it's interesting to think about privacy in the context of what's the value proposition that these devices are actually providing. I think that, while I do as a researcher, I remain very concerned about making sure we maintain privacy and confidentiality. But I think there's also the fact that we're willing to give up some of that if there's some value add to us. And I think that's very much on us to make sure that we bring that we make it worth it. I don't think it's possible at this point to ever guarantee people 100% privacy. So I think what we can do is talk about what's that balance between us trying to ensure privacy, but also making sure that we deliver something that will be useful to the user.
Yeah, I completely agree, Rhoda, and I have the same sense, probably because I guess we hang out in the same circles. There's this constant concern, and it's very well placed. I fully appreciate, but again, contextually, when you think about what goes on around us, I think that's the important thing to bear in mind. And I'm a dyed in the wool cognitivist. I love a good bit of testing and a bit of data collection, and I'm trying to piece together where cognitive screening fits into the modern world for trying early detection. And I heard John Dwyer on a call recently say, look, I'm talking to 20 major drug development sponsors. None of them are talking about cognitive testing. They're all talking about blood screening. I think there's still a role for both. And I think that we've got to find an efficient way of bringing the right people to our phlebotomists. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that the 80 blood-based biomarkers are obviously very exciting, and it allows us now to potentially screen people who are at risk for disease at scale that we've never been able to do before. But I say that with a caveat because we already know, for instance, from neuropathological studies, that you can have um, neuropathological criteria that meets AD diagnosis and not have ever clinically expressed the disease. So I always ask the question, if you have AD pathology in your brain, but you live your life cognitively intact, do you really care? And so the question here is, given the fact that we know from our bias studies that there are people walking around with AD pathology in their brain, um, how many people actually in the general population do? How much of it is that we all have some AD pathology? I suspect I might have some as well. But because it never reaches that clinical threshold of having impact on your daily living and in your cognitive state, how much is that really relevant? We actually don't know the answer to that question. So, blood based biomarkers will tell you, I think, people who have the pathology and certainly are at risk for clinically expressed disease. But until we have the clinical signal, I think we have to be very careful about what that means and what we should do about it.
Yeah, very well made point, and I completely agree. Again, one of the things that we're wrestling with in trying to get people in the very earliest stages is the balance between the people that come and see us in their late 40s who are biomarker positive, who are telling us their cognition's changed but are very high functioning, so we can't find it when we look. And then there's the scenario that you set out. So for me, it is about both in tandem, and probably trying to put some clinical and cognitive relevance on what we see in the way of biomarker change as well. So thank you for that. Very, very helpful. And I guess the other bits of this is as we're engaging with healthcare professionals, colleagues, the public, I find cognition is not a well understood construct. So even when I'm talking to primary healthcare physicians, I usually start with that sort of famous bald head slide of mine, where I list the key domains of cognition and talk about what I mean by them. And if I think about a good analogy, if I was sat in the pub with an uncle 40 years ago, actually probably 50 years ago now, and after dinner he's sort of rubbing his arm and his jaw and complaining he was short of breath and he had pain in his chest. We'd probably just put it down to indigestion, and then he'd happily drive home afterwards. I think now if that happened, either he or somebody close to him would say, "I think we're just going to take you off to A&E to get a quick ECG." So we've become very savvy about cardiac health. But I still have the sense that with cognitive health, we've got quite a good educational job to do to bring people up to speed. And I guess the advantage to doing that would be they can then take responsibility for their cognition, understand what we mean by it, and possibly even start testing it for themselves. Where would you sit on that, Rhoda?
Yeah, I think that if we could move away from thinking about cognition in a more stigmatized manner, where we're talking about things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and if we could really just shift the conversation and make it more about our brain health, right? I think that it's this idea, just like we think about physical health and we want to optimize our physical health and when we go in for our wellness checks, I think we need to bring that same concept into our brain health. I know people like George Brandenburg, with the Us Against Alzheimer's, et cetera. They've really actually made a push for getting the general public to start thinking about their brain health. And I always think that if we could focus on this idea that we are trying to actually optimize your brain health across your lifespan and make it less about disease, right? And more about maximizing your function. Because at the end of the day, everything we do through our brain, right? So when you enable brain health, you actually enable everything else that we as humans are capable of doing. And it just so happens that cognition is a component of that. So I really do think that we just need to shift this and make it less about disease and more about how do we go forward and function in our daily lives at the level of capacity that we are really able to do.
Yeah, thanks, Rhoda. And we had Mia on recently, Mia Kivipelto, talking about how in Finland they're shifting to now talking about not memory clinics, but cognition clinics and brain health clinics. So I get the sense there's a bit of a swell of opinion that we need to broaden that. And even at a personal level, when I got asked to do public engagement speaks here in the UK, I usually say, a primer on Alzheimer's disease, which didn't tend to get people through the door. And we've shifted it now to say your brain a user's guide, which seems to get people through the door. And then we can introduce some of the issues around what happens when things change. But to your very well made point, we can talk about what you can do to enhance, smart use of smart technology, teaching people mnemonics to help with their memory. That there seems to be a bunch of things we can do. And on the educational front, I'd be really keen because I know this is front and center for you. What does that shift in education look like? Is it literally as dull as schooling people on these topics? What are the things we could do to move the dial, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it refers to what we were just talking about. On the one hand, we think nothing about, having a check for our heart health. And it would be really great if we would just start to think like, oh yes, how's my brain? Let's do a little quick brain check, right? And keep that focus on, again, we're trying to optimize and it's not about disease. I think that what we've learned through Mia Kilpelto's work and others is that, there's lots and lots of ways in which we can prevent downstream Alzheimer's disease and other related disorders. So, if we can get people to really think about, oh, I want to make sure that I'm keeping up on my brain health, we actually are sowing the seeds for prevention of these diseases that we tend to fear about and then actually try to block out, right? That's part of the lack of receptivity is this fear. And so I think that in thinking about how do we educate people, again, we need to talk to them in ways in which they can hear us. And disease is too scary for them. So let's just talk about it in the same way, that we talk about other kinds of physical health, we should talk about brain health.
Yeah, I agree again. And in the UK, there are sort of models for what this might look like. And I suspect it's not particular to the UK. I suspect this is found elsewhere too. But so, for example, if you play rugby in the UK or if you're a jockey, at the beginning of every season, you would go through a fairly brief, but actually quite good in terms of content validity assessment. And we'd benchmark your cognition. We'd also try to work out if you were feigning bad, because that tends to be a tendency amongst athletic people. They want to give a high baseline so they can get back on the field or on the horse as quickly as possible. And that's very commonly done. And I wonder if that's part of the model that we might sell to the wider public. Just sort of benchmark your cognition to give us an idea of where you started and maybe an annual check. Does that seem to you a reasonable place to go?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what we did. I work with the Framingham Heart Study, so that's the longest running epidemiologic observational study that's multi-generational. We're 77 years young, I guess, is how to do it. And back in the day when Framingham first started, we didn't really know what risk factors for heart disease and stroke were. And so, but we had some ideas. And so the founders, understood that, oh, there's something maybe related to blood pressure and lipids. And so what they started to do is they started to monitor those on a regular basis. And lo and behold, as the evidence came through, that started to get integrated into what we now take for granted at our primary care health check, right? That we were going to measure your blood pressure, we're going to measure your glucose, etc. And I feel like that's the same thing that we need to be doing on the brain side. We just need to bring it in as something that's routine that we check on a regular basis based on risk factors, again, that we've already have some idea probably affect our brain health, like a lot of lifestyle behaviors, etc., that are actually modifiable. So I do think that in the same way that we've now have embraced sort of what we need to monitor and check on for our heart health, I think that we need to start doing that for our brain health.
Yeah, I agree, and I wonder if there's a sort of wider opportunity here. So, there are certain insurers in the UK with whom, if you have a policy, and you can show that you're making a commitment to keeping yourself healthy, sort of Fitbit monitoring, smart devices, that kind of thing, there can be reductions in your insurance premium. So I wonder if that might be an opportunity. Should we be reaching out to that community and stressing the importance of cognitive testing as well? Maybe that would move the dial.
Sure. I think insurance companies are actually the perfect, I think, starting point in thinking about what do we do? How do we use technologies to actually monitor different kinds of cognitively related behaviors so that we could actually do some sort of interventions, which again, Mia Kiel-Pelto, I think the Pointer study recently pointed out that you can do these modifications in your lifestyle and actually reduce your risks downstream for cognitive impairment and decline. So I do think that insurance companies in particular would have an interest, right, in offsetting these later life costs, because once you have cognitive impairment, that's a very significant increase, right, in sort of the healthcare costs. So if we could use these technologies on an ongoing basis, not a snapshot, so we can get it accurately. We already have these devices, so let's just capture them, harness them, use them to monitor. And in this way, if we can provide these on an ongoing basis as part of, let's say, your regular checkup, then we can start to do modification that will lead to that optimization that we're talking about. And then the end result is the reduction in these high cost cognitively related disorders downstream.
Yeah, and the imminent increase in so many more cases of Alzheimer's disease that we're stilled for has very much been a theme of the episodes we've done today. So good to remind people that we really do we needed a fix for a long time, but it's even more of an imperative now with that boomer generation coming up for risk for Alzheimer's disease and sadly other dementias. And I suppose that that idea of there's a carrot or a stick. I'm not quite sure how we would couch it. Maybe if insurance companies required it of us, then that might start to eat away at the stigma as well, because it just becomes part of your standard screening, doesn't it? You're not opting in and sort of saying, I feel like I'm at risk. You're just complying with the requirement they have. So I think maybe a combination of incentive and sort of a push-pull approach might start to move the dial there. And I suppose the other thing is, for those that want to volunteer into this, we need to make sure that it's engaging and compelling, so that we can carry people with us for years, possibly, just to make sure that we're constantly monitoring and picking up that very valuable data. Something we've always struggled with as a community, I think, is retention in these very long studies. I've come across studies where less than 20% of those that began it 18 months, 2 years later are still contributing data. What is it that we think we can do to fix that? Are there certain technologies that lend themselves to making life a little easier? How do we bother people just enough but not too much, Rhoda?
Yeah, I think that what we need to do is actually shift into use of passive technologies. Again, these are a lot of these technologies, they all use the same sensors, by the way. It's in the background. So if we can start to use these technologies that do it as you're moving about your environment without asking people to actively have to do something, I think that that would help move things forward, because it is very cumbersome to keep having to, repeat the same kinds of tasks over and over. It probably loses its value. It's interesting at the beginning to see how you're doing, but then as you're tracking it, we're talking about very subtle changes here over time. So from their viewpoint, it's like, you're kind of collecting the same thing over and over again, and it's not very meaningful once they get a sense of their own patterns. So I think that what we're trying to do is figure out, can we find a way to use these passive technologies that can be continuously collecting it without bothering people, burdening them, and yet be able to start to detect those negative trajectories of change as they start to emerge, and then alert people when it reaches some level of persistence and consistency that suggests that, there's actually something maybe going on here that's worth paying attention to. So I really think that as we move into those more and more passive technologies, I think that that's going to really move the field forward.
Yeah, I share your sense of optimism on that, and I've come across people who are looking at things like smartphone use, transition time on keypads, a whole host of things, and one assumes that we've got pretty good baseline data for individuals. So if there were a shift, then we'd be well placed to detect it. And I guess that sort of throws up a second issue. So one of the things that I always hear from clinicians, particularly those in primary healthcare, is, well, I do really want to know who seems to be in the very earliest stages of diseases that we're beginning to be able to do something about. But I also don't want too many false positives. I don't want somebody that just happened to have an extra glass of wine on Saturday night coming to me and saying, I think my cognition's gone south. So what do you think we can do to fix that? And in that context, are there experts in other fields that you think we could reach out to? I'm thinking the AI community and the machine learning community and the architecture that is imminent, the quantum computing facilities that are coming online. Maybe those are the kinds of people we should be reaching out to. What would be your take?
Yeah, I think that, obviously, as you mentioned, when you do this passive continuously monitoring, you're just going to be hit with a volume of information. And again, because of the heterogeneity of our behavior, it's going to be really hard to make sense of that. So I do think that that is where these new analytical advances, such as what AI is doing, which is really able to harness not just the quantity, but the multidimensionality of all this data in order to pick through and find those patterns, those actual patterns, consistent, right? Consistent, persistent patterns that start to emerge and make that available. And that's where I think then if the doctors can just give you sort of say, oh, here are the different devices that you're using. Here's an application that pulls it all together and then reports back to them in a much more summary fashion. Um, you know, Normal fluctuations that you'd see, nothing to worry about here, versus, there's actually this, again, that negative trajectory, subtle, but nonetheless persistent, that says, we need to pay attention to something that's going on here. So I don't know that we can get to that reality without embracing our AI colleagues. Data science in this whole arena is just changing rapidly, and it's changing rapidly in the face of all this volume of data. The more data we produce, the more these AI algorithms are going to get much more useful and accurate. And so I think we're definitely on this pathway where, you know, what we can do as humans in our humans' brains in terms of making sense of this, we're going way past that. And we're going to be very reliant on these advanced computational methods. And I'm very intrigued with the concept of quantum computing. Not sure that I fully understand what it does. I just understand that it's got a power to it that even takes us beyond what we currently think of in terms of deep machine learning. And so I'd be very interested to see how that moves us forward.
Yeah, and I share your sentiment. I've had the good fortune to hang out with people who seem to know how quantum computing works, and their line to me is, "Treat us like your microwave, John. You don't need to know how it heats your food up. You just need to know that it does, and what you need to do to get it hot." And I thought that's a really good metaphor for me to work with. So that I'm very happy to leave it there. But there was a little revelation for me. I went to a quantum computing summit in London last year, and the thing that I really took home was the announcement that with 3 to 5 years, access to platforms for quantum computing will be accessible. And a legacy of this development is that almost all the secure systems we have currently will become virtually redundant overnight when that happens. And that's it's a very compelling method for getting people like me engaged. So I think there's a good deal that we're going to get to do with this. And working with clients, so in my last employer, Scottish Brain Sciences, who are building this huge prospective study of people over the age of 50, it was lovely to have all the biomarker data and the neuroimaging and the genetic status and literally a very long list of variables. But we had to sit down quite often with real data experts and say, when we've got a decent size cohort, what do we actually do to manage and look at this? And it was way out of my expertise. So bringing in our colleagues from other disciplines, I think, is something that actually has again been a theme throughout the episodes of the podcast. So thank you for that. And I think the other thing that I like about it is, if we can find a digestible means for reporting back to people. In other contexts, we've sort of talked about traffic lights. So, there's red, amber, green. That's giving you a sort of simple mnemonic. That might be one way of capturing it very simply for people. And I guess if we're feeding back to users, not just healthcare professionals, but the general public who are interested in their cognition, it gives us a way in trying to get them to maybe move their own risk factors. So, one of the big issues we always have is we can tell people that there seems to be an issue. And the obvious next step, I think, is to try to get them to do something about that. We recently had the 10-year anniversary of Games for Health Europe. I've been lucky enough to be at all of them, and I've hosted the last 9. And a question I'm always very fond of asking speakers is, what's your benchmark of success for getting people to change their behavior? And back in the heady days of 2011, we were looking to move 10%, which even then felt pretty modest. Talking to people now with methodologies for changing people's behavior, 1% is a win. I mean, that's pretty modest in my book, but it seems to be the reality. So I wonder what we might do. Does digital offer us an opportunity to maybe not just measure, but engage? And are there methodologies we can use to get people to shift their behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, the value of digital again, and when we talk about all these different devices, is how they'll all bring different dimensions of usefulness, I think, to the person. And this goes back to my earlier comment. We really have to think about what is the value proposition, right? What is the utility to the person? It's not just about to us or their physicians, et cetera, but it's to them and to do it on an ongoing basis. And it turns out that it will probably shift over time. You know, what your value proposition is today as you learn more about yourself, et cetera, you're thinking about what's interesting or what's useful to you will also change. So, and there's also a difference between sort of whether the physician or I as a family member would value as information versus what the person would actually value. So one of the things I found really interesting is a number of years ago, I was in China, and so this was pre-COVID, and I was attending one of their health innovation events, and it was really interesting because one of the startup companies had a device that they had people wear around their neck, and it was really set up. Their intent was to be able to track people who had Alzheimer's disease and to be able to see if they're starting to wander beyond the premises. So it was really a feature that both their care team and their family members were very interested to make sure that the safety and the welfare of their family member was something that they didn't have to worry about. But it turns out that the reason that the person was wearing it had nothing to do with allowing people to track him. It was because it had a radio feature. And so they would wear it because they wanted to listen to the news and music. So I thought that was for me a kind of an aha moment where I realized that, these different digital devices can can be different things for different people. And that's what I think the value of the digital is that we can take that digital information and we can utilize it in different ways to produce value, same sensor related data, but different value, both for the person and over time, as well as to those who care about them.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that anecdote, Rhoda, that, despite your best intentions, actually, the reason why people use it is something you probably haven't even contemplated. So a happy accident, but good to know that that can be a motivation. Thanks for sharing that. That was really helpful. And I guess the next question sort of drops out from many of these conversations. So I engage a lot with the vendor community, and as you and I have chatted many times, it's a very busy space. Literally every week, one or two new companies ring me and say, I've got a new cognitive digital biomarker. And I have to say they're mostly a bit unexciting. So, it would be quite nice to get somebody phone up and say, I've got something radically different you'll never have heard about before, but that doesn't tend to happen very much. And one of the things that I've engaged when, I've worked for Cogstate, for Cambridge Cognition, a little bit with the cognitive drug research people. And we've always had at some point quite a big publicity events. Typically, there's been a paper and suddenly we've got interest from radio and TV. And then we get a deluge of the public ringing up saying, I'm very worried about my cognition. I want to take your test. And the inclination has always been, and we want to help you do that. But then there's an element of caution that if you're giving people access to cognitive testing, and it's maybe flagging that not everything's as well as it might be, or perhaps there's been a negative change since last time, there might be an issue around we now owe these people a duty of care. And I wonder if we need to not overpromise. Maybe we should just focus rather more on the detection and the signposting, and providing the right information rather than making any very categoric decisions or giving advice about their risk status. Does that seem to you a sensible thing to try to achieve?
No, I think we're right now going through some sort of transition in terms of when we think about health and healthcare. I think in the old days, it was very much driven by the healthcare provider, and they're making their suggestions of what we should and shouldn't do. I think in today, we have such an explosion of information and available information that I think people are learning to become much more advocates of their own health. And I think that so I think we need to move from this idea that we're going to wait for the health care world to tell us what we want to do. And rather, we need to start taking the information that we're gathering through all these different digital devices that are giving us information and at least come and bringing it forward. I think that changing the narrative of who's responsible for your health, I think is really important. And in this context, I do think that providing information much more transparently is actually very important. It's going to require transition for us to be able to do this, obviously in ways that are responsible and aren't alarming as in the way that you talk about. But I also think we're talking about this in the context where we're learning more and more that there are things that you can do. We used to always think that Alzheimer's disease was just once you have the diagnosis, it's inevitable that you're going to go down that path. And I think our more recent studies, as well as some of the emerging drug treatments, suggest no, there actually are probably interventions, and we're thinking about and identifying ways in which to intervene much earlier, and earlier, well before the onset of disease would normally be considered. So I actually believe that we do want to see a shift where you see more of the citizen scientists coming forward and and bringing it forward, but doing it in the context of having a support system in order to help them interpret, understand, and figure out what are the next steps forward.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Rhoda, and I share your sentiment. And just to personalize it, every year I get a kit from my local pharmacy, and I test my blood sugars and a whole bunch of other things for myself. And if I think there's an issue, I just go get professional advice, and we repeat it and see if there's actually anything going on. So I think the model's established. And if I think about genetic screening companies, 23andMe, for example, they were offering information and signposting, but potentially some of that might have been disappointing. If you found out you were ApoE4 homozygous, that's probably not good news, right? So I guess there's context always to these things. And I think your characterization of the opportunities is a really helpful one. So thank you again. And I wanted to finish with just a sort of a broad opportunity for you, and with apologies for putting you on the spot, but um, I find myself quite excited about going to conferences in the Alzheimer's space in the last couple of years. And for a very long time, I felt, well, I probably should show up just to tell people that I'm still around and interested in doing work. But in the last 2 years, I think AAIC in Toronto recently, and actually past events, there's been a real buzz. There's a real sense of excitement, and in lots of different areas. And a question we've asked all of our guests, and I'm keen to put to you: is there one element of the technology development or the therapeutics that you would point to and say is the most promising or exciting breakthrough that you've seen in the last few years?
I think it's unquestionable that the blood-based biomarkers, their emergence, I really think that pretty much is going to change the landscape for us. they're going to be able to allow us to fill gaps of information. I talked about the fact that we don't know how much AD pathology actually exists, in the general population. And we need to get a very good handle on that to understand what's the true risk of disease emergence, right, across the population. So, and we're going to be able to do this at such a scalable level because collecting blood, right, and testing blood is something that we're very well acquainted. And what I also think is going to be sort of where we're going to head is if we can start to couple sort of what blood-based biomarkers are broadening up and add to that this digital component. Because I think if you pair the two together, you're talking about methods that we can bring to global scale, right? Most people know how to collect and store and measure from blood. And now, with all these digital devices, we're going to be able to do the same thing. We're going to be able to collect digital, store it, and analyze it. And I think that the two together are going to overcome a lot of the different biases that we've had in research, clinical trials, and care to date, because we're going to be able to do this as so much more of an inclusive manner than we have. So I think a lot about where we need to go next with our digital revolution. I worry a lot about what we're doing on the back end side of this to make sure that we do the careful work that we've done around plasma biomarkers, right? So we've done a lot of investment and work in validating what the potential of these blood based biomarkers could be. And I really do think that we need to think about that same careful approach when we come to digital. And then if we do that and bring it together, I think we'll be upending actually how we think about our research, care, and trials.
Dr. Rhoda Au, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your knowledge and expertise. It's been a truly illuminating conversation, learning more about the essential role of digital and blood biomarkers in diagnosing early Alzheimer's disease.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to future ones.
I want to end with this. We began this series with the coming circle of hope of new therapies, and we're ending with a beacon of hope that in the future we can make the diagnostic process easier and faster for people living with Alzheimer's disease or those who are at risk of the disease. My name's John Harrison. I've thoroughly enjoyed my time on this podcast series. My thanks to Pearson and to all the support team. Thank you for listening. It's been a pleasure.
This has been such a fascinating conversation, and thank you, Dr. Harrison, for your thoughtful guidance and expertise, not only today, but throughout all 4 episodes. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. Across these episodes, we've had the privilege of hearing from some of the leading voices in Alzheimer's research, diagnosis, and care. And the message is clear. There is reason for optimism. This concludes this season of our podcast series, The Progress Profile, Alzheimer's Research in Focus. Thank you for listening.